running. בסדר? אתה מתחיל בטושות? אוקיי. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
My guest today is Professor Moshe Arens. He's a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. He's a member of Prime Minister Begin's party, the Likud, who voted against the Camp David peace accords. Professor Arens, I think from the American political perspective, one of the most amazing things about Israeli politics is the fact that Prime Minister Begin, before he became Prime Minister, has been able to maintain such an incredibly effective control over his political party. I don't think in the history of democratic countries someone has been able to maintain control while out of power for that long a period of time. How do you explain his ability to do that?
By maintaining control, I guess you mean being the leader of the party
Correct.
for a continuous period over a long period of time. Well, first of all, as you can see, he's a dominant personality and a very capable man and impressive man, I guess, by any standards. On the other hand, he's had to fend off a number of contenders along the way. And one of them is quite well known today, General Weitzman, who has left the cabinet in the meantime. But he started something of a palace revolt against Begin some 10 years ago. He wasn't successful. He thought he was going to be. Begin managed to beat him down. Mr. Tamir, a man I understand that you've interviewed,
Right.
was at one time a member of Mr. Begin's party, started a palace revolt against Begin, was not successful. So it isn't as if he had total control without any opposition. He's had opposition, he's had to fend off contenders, he's been successful in beating them off.
Of course, whenever I interview anyone from labor, and I've interviewed Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, the distinction they tend to make between the labor alignment and Likud is the fact that labor is infinitely more democratic, while Likud is essentially a one-man show. Do you think that's fair?
No, it's not only isn't it fair, it's not correct. First of all, Likud is not a one-man show, as I've indicated to you, that there were attempts to unseat the leader of the party, and these attempts were defeated democratically by finally bringing them out to vote in the councils of the party. You might say, well, what's the criterion by which you could judge the degree of democracy in the party, say Likud versus the Labour Party? Well, I'd say a very important criterion or test would be how are the candidates for membership in the Knesset determined? Well, in the Labour Party, they are essentially determined by what they call a nominating committee. These are the backroom boys who will get together, and they make up the list of people who will be in the Knesset. In Charut, which is the major component of the Likud, this is Begin's party and the party that I belong to, the candidates for the Knesset are elected and by secret ballot in the executive committee of the party, which numbers 1,000 people. And these are free and democratic elections. And the result is not only that, in that sense at least, and I think in many other ways, Likud is a more democratic framework than the Labour Party, but the Likud has brought better candidates to the Knesset as a result.
Also, the concept of party loyalty in Israel is somewhat confusing to Americans. Obviously, we have essentially a two-party system, and in Israel there are a multiplicity of parties. But even more to the point, when you look at a party like Likud, which it seems to be, at least from the American perspective, that the crowning achievement of Begin's first administration certainly was the Camp David peace accords, and yet you, a member of his own party, voted against that. Is that, in Israeli terms, considered in any way to be disloyal, or is that considered the kind of thing that would cause someone to resign?
Well, first of all, it shows you how democratic the party is, right? And that was not...
Assuming that you have not and will not be punished for doing that, you're still around.
The Camp David Accords were signed, when? In 1978. Right, and here we are in 1981, so 3 years have gone by. No, I haven't been punished, and I occupy, I guess, a reasonably senior position in the party. I'm the chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in the Knesset, and this is an elected position by the party caucus So, no, I haven't taken any punishment. I was offered a job in the government by Mr. Begin. He suggested that I become defense minister about half a year ago, and I turned that down. No, I have not been punished, and none of the people who voted against the agreement were. It was, I guess, surprising to some people because it was something that the Prime Minister had accomplished, considered it to be, I guess considers it to be a great accomplishment to this day. And I suppose that many people would naturally expect that all of the members of his party would naturally vote for it. After all, the opposition, almost the entire opposition, voted for the Camp David Agreement. Well, not all of the Democrats in the Senate voted for the Panama Canal Agreement, I guess. And as it turns out, not all of the Likud people voted for the Camp David Agreement.
Why did you vote against the Camp David Agreement?
I think it's probably more comprehensible to people right at this very time than maybe it was even at that time. Namely, what is the degree of risk that Israel took upon itself by giving up the entire Sinai? 100%. This is what Sadat demanded. Not 96%, but 100%.
All the air bases, all the settlements, and all the oil.
All the oil wells, the entrance into the Gulf of Eilat, the demand to uproot our settlers. This is something that hasn't happened since World War II. That people are going to be pulled out of their houses and farmers off their fields. And this in return for a very important agreement, a peace agreement, but with a country which is a dictatorship, with Sadat.
That's probably widely misunderstood in the United States, that
Well,
Egypt is in fact a
Well, it may be,
dictatorship.
but I think probably not at the present time, because as you probably know, in the last week, Sadat is cracking down.
He's arrested some 1,500
Over 1,500
opposition
people into jail, you know. These are the sort of things that we've never heard of in democratic countries. And it's pretty clear that if the people who are in opposition to Sadat, the ones who were just thrown to jail, were to come into power, that would be the end of the peace treaty. And Israel would suddenly find itself without the oil, without the bases, with its settlers uprooted, without all of the Sinai, and without peace with Egypt. So it was basically, I would say, what in the scientific lingo you would call decision-making under uncertainty, a gambling type situation. And those people like myself who felt that we were conceding too much, nobody was against the peace treaty. Nobody was against peace with Egypt, and nobody today is against peace with Syria. But the people who opposed the treaty opposed the terms of the treaty and felt that we were just gambling too much, putting too much down on the table, considering the basic uncertainties. And one of the most significant of them, of course, is the type of regime they have in Egypt, and therefore the danger that Sadat could be toppled, Sadat could go for biological reasons, or Sadat could change his mind, as he had in the past.
Well, if you had been, at the time of that vote, a member of Begin's cabinet, as opposed to simply a member of the Knesset, and from the standpoint of your conscience, you felt that it was necessary to be against the Camp David Accords, would that, under the Israeli system, almost have required a resignation?
Well, in my interpretation, yes. I definitely would have resigned, and when Mr. Begin offered me the job of Minister of Defense after Weizmann's resignation, I felt that I could not join the government because in the Israeli parliamentary system, a cabinet member, unlike in the United States, is in effect a representative of a party or a party faction who shares responsibility for all of the decisions of the cabinet. And so if I had been a cabinet member, or even if I joined it after the Camp David Accords, I felt that I would be taking upon my shoulders part of the responsibility for a policy that I didn't agree with.
I think there are very, very few American politicians that, regardless of what the merits of any given policy might have been, would have turned down one of the, probably the second most powerful job in the state of Israel, as you apparently did after Weizmann resigned.
Well, as I understand the American system, I don't think that a member of the President's cabinet shares responsibility for all of the President's policies and for all of the cabinet decisions. Correct. So it isn't quite the same thing.
What is your prediction of what will happen after Begin leaves the scene in terms of who will lead Likud? The names we hear in America as potential candidates, the most likely replacements, are Ezra Weizmann or Ariel Sharon, the present Minister of Defense.
Well, first of all, it's a difficult question, just like if I were to ask you what's going to happen after Reagan in the Republican Party. I guess there are a number of contenders. Nobody really knows, and that's the situation here. I think Weizmann's chances are just about nil. Weizmann is hardly a member of the party anymore, certainly not a member in good standing. He voted against the government in the Knesset on a confidence motion. That's unheard of. I voted against the government on a specific issue, but not on confidence in the government.
So that would be considered disloyal?
That would be considered disloyal. That would be considered even grounds for expulsion from the party. Weizmann was asked to leave the party. He has since been very critical of the party, of Mr. Begin. I think he stands almost no chance at all. It would take some earthquake-type situation here for him to come back into a leading position. People in the party don't at all see him at all anymore as a man who in any way is identified with the positions of the party, with the mainstream of thinking within the party. Sharon is different. Sharon is a member in good standing of the party. He today has a senior position in the government. He is the defense minister. And I'm sure that he sees himself as a contender, at least I would think so, once the occasion arose. And I think he would be one of the contenders. He's not the only one. There's Mary Dore, who today is Minister for Economic Coordination. There's Shamir, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Some others may come along. It depends on just when this particular issue will come up.
Somewhat analogous to the Weizmann situation, when I interviewed Yitzhak Rabin, who was former Prime Minister of Israel, and I asked him that whenever the labor line is mentioned in the United States media, it's always two dominant figures, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, and almost always in the same sentence or in immediately following sentences, they will describe them as bitter foes. And I thought he'd really avoid the question, but he didn't, and he admitted that it went back quite a ways. And he felt that when he was Prime Minister and when Peres was his Minister of Defense, he felt that Peres was not loyal to him.
Yes, it's not, if you're referring to the Begin-Weizmann situation, it really is not analogous, because Rabin has been very careful throughout all these years of dispute with Peres to continuously emphasize the fact that he is a member of the Labour Party, that he is loyal to the Labour Party, that he will accept all decisions of Labour Party forums. And that has not been the case for Mr. Weizmann, who in effect today is outside the framework.
I guess he's going to start writing. He's written a book.
He has written 2 books, and the most recent one, of course, was about the Camp David Accord.
Well, he is in favor of the Camp David Accords, is he not?
Yes, of course. He sees himself as one of the
architects
of that accord, right.
Do you feel that historically, and certainly since the 1967 war in particular, during that time frame, that the United States has put too much pressure on the State of Israel to make concessions, very tangible concessions, for somewhat ephemeral hopes?
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree with that. I don't think there's been any very real or significant pressure where Israel felt that it had no choice. And I don't think that you would find many instances, if any, where you could say Israel agreed to concessions that it would not have agreed to unless it had been for United States pressure. I think in almost all cases, and possibly in all cases, where Israel has agreed to concessions since 1967, and these are primarily in the interim agreements that Rabin negotiated, Golda, Meir, and then Rabin negotiated in 1975 after the Yom Kippur War, and in the Camp David Agreement. I think in all cases we're really talking about concessions that Israel, of its own free will, would have undertaken. Mistaken or not, in my case, and in most cases mistaken. But I don't think it would be fair to say that Israelis agreed to these concessions under American pressure. But I think that in all those cases it was clear that that was America's desire, and that may have had some influence on the people here. In my view, that desire was misplaced. It didn't serve Israeli interests, it didn't serve American interests. And my guess is there probably are some people in the United States today, possibly in the Reagan administration, who must feel that the Israeli evacuation of the entire Sinai, especially of the naval base at Sharm el-Sheikh and the air bases, is not good for the United States and for the Western position in the Middle East.
From the standpoint of American perceptions, even as Prime Minister Begin is meeting with President Reagan in September of 1981, he's presented on a cover of a national magazine as being an obstacle to peace, whereas Sadat, as I'm sure you're aware, would win any public opinion poll. He's more popular in the States than any Israeli leader. How do you account for that? Is it simply public relations?
Well, it's difficult for me here in Israel, although I do visit the United States often to really give
And
you
you really
an
grew up in
explanation.
the States.
Yes, but I guess people who understand PR in the United States can give you a much better answer. I think part of it, of course, has to do with the initial conditions from which the process starts, and the fact that there's been such a tremendous reversal of Sadat's position. So starting from a position where he was obviously a dictator in an Egypt that was closely aligned with the Soviet Union, dedicated to the destruction of Israel, talking about the readiness to sacrifice 2 million Egyptian lives in order to wipe Israel off the map. This man has suddenly made this tremendous change, went to Jerusalem, a very dramatic gesture, I guess one of the great media events of this decade, bolted the standard Arab line of attack against Israel. I think all of this, of course, has played in his favor to a very large degree. And although you might say that Begin has played somewhat of a parallel role, certainly not to the same extent, because Begin never talked about destroying the state of Egypt or being ready to sacrifice millions of Israeli lives in order to do that, but Begin was looked upon as being a hardliner while he was in opposition, certainly more hardline than the Labour Party, and here he's come into power and he's made an agreement to give up the entire Sinai. But I think the PR benefits were not anything like the same. And Sadat, I think, is still enjoying the fruits of that tremendous, dramatic change that he's made and the dramatic move he made back on Jerusalem.
The way the situation is presented in the media in the States, it seems to be that the one big bone of contention preventing peace in this area is the so-called Palestinian question, the PLO, a separate state, and the new magic word, almost as magic as détente was, the word of autonomy. What is the solution to the so-called Palestinian problem, in your judgment?
Well, you know that that's an issue that is very widely discussed in Israel. I must have participated in maybe 25 or 30 symposia on that subject, and I'm sure I'm going to appear at some more. And yet, at every one of them, I find that people are not at all careful to define, before they start the discussion, just who the Palestinians are, and just exactly what their problem is, and whether that problem has any solution, because we know there are many problems in this world that have no solution, whether you start from mathematics or go on to economics, and certainly when you go on to political problems. So, in my view, the Palestinians are those Arabs and their descendants who lived in the mandated area of Palestine. And that is the Palestinian Arabs that today live in Israel.
Under the British mandate, which began after World War I and ended shortly before the creation of the State of Israel.
1948, right? That's where the concept of Palestine originated, and that's when the borders of Palestine were established. And like some of the other states in the region, like Syria or Iraq, these are not nation-states in the European sense of the word, in the sense that they date back hundreds of years. These are states that were arbitrarily and almost artificially created after World War I, and have assumed a certain state-like quality and certain of the attributes of nationhood. Well, Palestine was established after World War I.
There was no Palestine under the Ottoman Empire?
No, there wasn't.
Prior to World War I?
There wasn't even a Palestinian province as such. Palestine at that time was part of Syria in terms of the way it was administered by the Turks. And there certainly were no Palestinian people or no aspirations of the Palestinian people. There was no such thing. All that anybody heard of national aspirations in the Arab world, say in World War I, were national Arab aspirations. It was the British and the French who afterwards cut the Middle East up into different countries.
How could that fact be so... That's all right. You gave it.
Yes, it was.
All right, no problem. No problem. I got a 2-minute warning. No.
Okay. 5. Can you look, please? Okay, please.
5, 4, 3, 2.
The Palestinians, then, are those Arabs or their descendants?
Sorry?
Same again. 5, 4, 3. Just look at Mr. Arens on it, sir. 2. Okay.
The Palestinians, to the extent to which they have a national identity, are those Arabs or their descendants who lived in the mandated territory of Palestine, as was mandated to Britain after World War I by the League of Nations. So those are the Arabs that live in the State of Israel, the Arabs that live in Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, or what you in the United States call the West Bank, and the Arabs that live in the Kingdom of Jordan. All right, now what's their problem? Now it's often put forth that their problem is that they are a homeless people, just like the Jews were before the State of Israel were established, and that therefore, in order to solve their problem, a state must be set up for them. Well, there's nothing farther from the truth than that, because there is a Palestinian state today, and it's Jordan. That's 80% of the territory that was mandated as Palestine to Britain for the establishment of the Jewish state. So they have a country of their own. The leader of Jordan is not a Palestinian, that's true. Hussein and his family were brought in from what is today Saudi Arabia by the British and were implanted in what was then called Transjordan and today the Kingdom of Jordan.
King Abdullah.
King Abdullah, right. Hussein's grandfather. And if Jordan had democratic elections, and no Arab country does, as you know, and if Mr. Arafat ran against Hussein, it's quite possible that Arafat would win. And you know that the PLO tried to take over Jordan in what they call September of 1970.
1970.
And Hussein drove them out, and now they're located in Lebanon. So they have a country. So that's not the problem. So the problem may be that Palestinians don't want to live as a minority anywhere. Somewhere along the lines, wherever Arabic is spoken, there must be Arab rule. Right? We've heard that before in other places, in Europe some years ago. And I don't doubt that there are Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria or in the Gaza Strip or even in Israel itself who would prefer to have Arab sovereignty in that area rather than Israeli sovereignty. So it really comes down to the fact, where should the border lie between Israel and the neighboring Palestinian state, between Israel and Jordan. And you know that the border separating Israel from Jordan until 1967 were what we call the 1949 armistice lines, where the fighting stopped in 1949, and Judea and Samaria were under Hussein's control. The Gaza Strip was under Egypt's control.
And interestingly, until 67, when it was under Hussein's control, he never gave them a so-called state.
Oh, of course not. But the problem was not solved. Until 1967, there was a continuous move afoot on the part of the Arab world as a whole, including King Jordan, including King Hussein and Jordan, including an organization called the PLO that was established before 1967.
64.
Yeah, right. Whose aim it was to bring about the destruction of Israel. And it was even these borders were not satisfactory. And their aim was to bring the borders right out to the Mediterranean and throw the Jews into the sea.
Through Jerusalem and Tel Aviv.
So basically, the problem is where that border should be. I would say it is inevitable that Palestinian Arabs will be living, some of the Palestinian Arabs will be living as a minority in Israel, as opposed to all those who live in Jordan in their own country. I don't think that's so terrible, or that that's a problem that people can't live with. After all, there are ethnic minorities throughout the world, the United States as well. And people can reconcile themselves to living as a minority if they live in a free country, and if they feel that they have equality of rights and of opportunities. And I think that you will find that there are many Palestinians in Israel today, and I would guess even some in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, who would prefer to live in a free and democratic Israel rather than living in a dictatorship that's run by Mr. Arafat.
But of course, one of the practical problems is that the situation has become so polarized, so politicized, so terrorized, if you will, that moderate Palestinians who honestly believe that way, that they would prefer to live in a democratic society, are afraid to say so.
Well, they're not afraid to say so if they live in Israel proper, because they're, although we've had some examples of terror here as well, they've been few and far between, and I guess that most Israeli Arabs feel themselves free to pledge their allegiance to the State of Israel. You know, they're Palestinian Arab members of Israeli Knesset. In Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip, of course, it's been far more difficult, different. There's been very extensive terrorism. There's a long list of people who've been knocked off by the PLO because they didn't subscribe totally to the PLO, or because they talked in terms of negotiating with Israel, of making peace with Israel. And that is certainly one of the problems that we have in the area. Terror.
When I interviewed General Chaim Herzog, who was the ambassador to the United Nations, and we went through the history of Resolution 242 and then Resolution 338, after the 73 war, he told me something that I had never really heard before. He said that when those two resolutions were discussed and Arab delegations were involved in the details of the wording, the drafting of those two resolutions, never at any time was a Palestinian state discussed. Then there was a public relations firm in America in about 1974 that came up with a brilliant idea that America perceives Israel as the underdog, and the only way to get American public opinion, at least, in favor of the Palestinian people, so-called, whatever that entity is to make them the underdog. And that's really what amounted to that very, very significant change in this whole concept of requiring a state.
Yeah, well, I'll add to that.
Please do.
Country like Syria, right, which presumably is a supporter of the PLO, is a supporter of the PLO. As a matter of fact, two of the major constituent organizations in PLO are Syrian-backed, Syrian-financed, Syrian-commanded, SAICA being the most important of them. Now, Syria is run by Assad, the dictatorship, who's the leader of the Ba'ath Party. Syrian wing of the Ba'ath Party. The Iraqis have their own wing of the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party has an ideology, has a constitution. The Ba'ath Party is opposed to the Palestinian state. The Ba'ath Party believes in a greater Syria. It feels that Israel, Palestine, Jordan really should be integral parts of Syria. But this doesn't stop Mr. Assad from providing support to the PLO and actually having a constituent group, which is his, that is part of the PLO.
Consistency has certainly not been a virtue in terms of intra-Arab relations.
No, it's not only lack of consistency. I think this is an obvious masquerade. They're using this thing as a hobby horse without at all believing it. The same thing's true of the Iraqis. The Iraqi Ba'ath Party, like the Syrian Ba'ath Party, does not believe in a Palestinian state. They believe in the Fertile Crescent, in Iraq controlling the entire area. But in the meantime, it makes good politics for them to support the PLO and act as if they are for a Palestinian state.
Having grown up in America and going back there quite frequently, I'm sure you have some kind of feel for the American psyche during the period of time our hostages were held in Iran. And there was a certain body of opinion that when month followed month and it became a year and it was over a year and we watched this lunatic Khomeini and we saw on television what was happening day in and day out, there was at least a body of opinion in America that said, well, you know, this is just crazy. Could you imagine, and they gave two examples, could you imagine either the Soviet Union or Israel putting up with this kind of a situation? A lot of Americans feel that this is just a disgraceful episode in their history where they simply let Khomeini hold all the cards and that we were utterly powerless. How do you perceive it personally, and how do Israelis generally perceive it?
Well, I think it is pretty well recognized at the present time throughout the world, in the United States as well, that the United States, although a superpower, although having tremendous non-conventional capabilities, really does not have the conventional military capability commensurate with the dangers that it is facing, with the problems that may arise, and this is exemplified in the Middle East. President Carter said, I guess towards the end of his term of office, that oil supply from the Middle East was a vital problem for the United States. But I think it was clear that the conventional military potential required to protect that vital interest really was not there. And that came to light in Iran when the hostages were taken and there wasn't the capability to free them or to force the Iranians to free them. That came to light again when the Russians moved into Afghanistan, I guess with considerable certainty that the West, meaning the United States, really did not have the military capability to stop them from doing so. I think that people in the United States today are aware of this. Certainly it seems like President Reagan is. And I guess that an effort will be made to build up a conventional military potential. The United States certainly has the capability. It's got the manpower, it's got the economic resources to do that. The question is whether it has the will to do it. And I think in time we will see a United States military capability that's capable of dealing with these kind of problems.
Well, all right. I mean, taking that even as a given, that we lacked the conventional means to invade Iran successfully, you're not saying that America's hands were simply tied and we just had to put up with that situation, because if maybe Khomeini wouldn't have been ready to give him back for 2 or 3 years more.
Well, I think it's the kind of situation in which the nuclear capability the United States has is really not relevant. I don't think anybody in his right mind would have suggested the United States threaten the Iranians with a nuclear strike unless they release the hostages, just as it was irrelevant or not applicable to the Afghanistan situation. So if your nuclear capability is not applicable, the only thing that you have to count on then is your conventional capability. And you either have the capability to twist their arm, to threaten them, so maybe they'll give up the hostages without a fight, or if necessary, go in and fight it out. Now, I know that based on Israeli examples, people would like to think in terms of surgical strikes. That presumably is the best of all possible worlds.
Like in Entebbe.
Right. You don't need a big conventional force. You don't get involved in even a minor league war. You go in, you go out, nobody gets killed, hopefully, and the problem is solved. Those are very, very difficult things to do. And I suppose that some Israelis had considered the problems of a surgical strike in order to free the hostages in Tehran. And I think to most Israelis it seemed like a very difficult job. Now, I wouldn't say impossible, and clearly some U.S. military thought that it was possible, but it was very difficult.
In terms of the rescue mission that failed.
Sure, well, in terms of the distances and where the people were held and so forth, very difficult.
But certainly if America had asked Israel for a base or for use of its facilities, I can't see Israel having refused them.
No, I don't think Israel would have refused them. We're talking about a hypothetical situation that in the past, so
it's a shame it's hypothetical, because I would have loved for Carter to have asked Israel.
And maybe, you know, Israelis are not overly modest. Maybe Israeli advice could have helped, could have improved the chances of the mission being a success. But I think it would be less than honest not to say that this basically was a very difficult mission and really not too far from Mission Impossible.
Yeah, but I think underlying the basic difference between the United States and Israel, people forget that although the Entebbe mission turned out wonderfully and brilliantly, although a couple of lives were lost out of the 100-some-odd hostages, the significant dramatic point is that when the Israelis got together, the Ministry of Defense, the Prime Minister, whatever leaders were involved in making that decision, they were willing to risk the 100 lives. They knew that if the Entebbe mission failed, all of those people were dead, whereas America was never willing to make the same sacrifice, even on a theoretical basis.
Well, I think you're pointing to a difference that, of course, exists between Israel and the United States, or if you will, between the United States today and the United States in the days of World War II. Sense of purpose, sense of dedication, a readiness to mobilize, a readiness to bear sacrifice. I don't want to pat ourselves on the shoulder. If we have all that, and we have all that, of course it is because Israel has lived through 32 years of struggle, has gone through 5 wars. It is clear to just about every citizen of Israel that unless we mobilize, unless we dedicate part of our time and a good part of our economic capabilities to the national good, for national defense, unless we serve 3 years in the Army for men and 2 years in the Army for girls, conscription service, and afterwards in the reserves, the physical safety of the people of Israel is in danger. Now, as best as I understand, there isn't that kind of consciousness in the United States today.
No, certainly isn't.
This is the reason, I suppose, why there's not a draft. Although I think most Americans realize that the only way you can have a good conventional armed force is if you have a draft. Because, as we in Israel have learned, a good conventional force is not just made up of good tanks and good airplanes. First and foremost, it's made up of good people. You have to get your best high school graduates, your best college graduates into the Army. And in this day and age, there's no way of doing this except by conscription.
If the PLO is Israel's #1 enemy, it oftentimes seems that Israel's #2 enemy is the United Nations. From Israel's point of view, does the United Nations serve any useful function in the world, or would Israel just as soon see that organization disappear?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say that the PLO is Israel's #1 enemy, because the PLO's military potential is really very limited. And although it's of concern to Israel, and people in Israel have been killed by PLO people, mostly women and children, it doesn't really represent a danger to Israel's existence. The surrounding Arab armies do. The Syrian army, the Iraqi army, the Saudis maybe in the future with AWACS and F-15s and whatever else they're going to get, backed by the Soviet Union. This has been the real danger to Israel. And as you know, Israel stood off the combined forces of all the Arab armies with the Soviet Union in the background. Israeli pilots have shot down Russian piloted MiGs over the Sinai, as you probably remember. The UN, well, I think the UN is probably as much of a problem to the United States as it is to Israel. The UN, because of the way it is structured, unlike the League of Nations, has got a built-in automatic majority for a coalition made of the Soviet Union and its communist satellites, the Arab countries, and some of the third world countries that are dragged in the wake of the Soviet Union and the Arab countries. And this is an automatic majority not only against Israel. I think in most cases it's an automatic majority against anything that is important to the United States or to the West. So with this kind of a structure, I would say the UN is really not very useful. I'm not for abrogating the United Nations, and I suppose here and there on some really not very important matters, maybe in the area of culture or economics or planning, it performs some useful function. But politically, I really don't see it doing much good to the world.
And certainly not from a peacekeeping standpoint.
Certainly not from a peacekeeping.
Because it was the removal of the UN, but when Nasser said, get out, led to that war, 67.
Not only that, I think that it would be fair to say that the UN has provided encouragement to the PLO, to terrorist forces. And I wouldn't say that without the existence of the UN, some of the terrorist activities carried out by the PLO would not have been carried out, but I think the PLO feels that they enjoy the support of some of the UN people at the top.
What do you see happening in the 1980s in the Middle East vis-a-vis Israel and its Arab neighbors, vis-a-vis the world American-Soviet conflict in this area? And most people agree that if there ever is a third world war, it's this area which is going to cause it.
Well, there's no way of telling. You know, what was Louis B. Mayer who said, you know, forecasting is very difficult, especially about the future. So who knows?
Sam Goldwyn might have said that.
Yeah.
Or one of the two.
Oh, maybe, yeah. Maybe it's Sam Goldwyn. Well, first of all, we're hoping, I think with a certain degree of justification, that the Arab world is changing. That it will not continue to be that same system of dictatorial regimes, some of them almost medieval in nature, like Saudi Arabia, that they will progress, possibly the tremendous inflow of economic resources will bring about this change. And that if we come back to the Middle East 10 or 15 years from now, we will find that some of the countries either are democratic or moved in the direction of democratic government. And I think that is really the necessary condition for a basic change in the Middle East, the necessary condition for the end to the Israeli-Arab conflict. I think a democratic Saudi Arabia or a democratic Egypt or a democratic Syria will find that they have made